Hastings Racecourse in Vancouver, British Columbia has run its last horse race after 133 years of continuous operation. 133 years, gone with a single announcement on a Friday evening. And the ripple effects? They're massive.
Yeah, this one hits like a punch to the chest. For generations, Hastings was a cornerstone of the West Coast racing circuit. It wasn't just a track, it was a community hub, a training ground, a cultural landmark. Anyone who grew up on the Canadian racing scene has a Hastings story. So when Great Canadian Entertainment Corp stepped forward and said, essentially, this is the end, you could almost feel the collective gasp across the racing world.
Let's start by laying out the facts. Great Canadian Entertainment, who operate the racetrack and the on-site casino, released a one-page statement announcing that Hastings Racecourse would no longer host live horse racing. Wayne Odegaard, the regional vice president, didn't mince words. He called it a, quote, strictly a business decision based on a lack of economic feasibility to move forward with another season, unquote. And that line really defines what's happening here. This wasn't emotion. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a numbers game, and the numbers just stopped adding up.
But the deeper part of the story, the spark that lit the final fuse, came 1 week earlier. Nina Krieger, British Columbia's Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General, announced the government would be ending the slot machine revenue subsidies that had been supporting purse money at Hastings. That casino opened in 2008, and ever since then, it's basically been the lifeline of the racing product. Pull out the lifeline, and the ecosystem collapses.
Right, and in Krieger's letter announcing the cuts, she was explicit. The racing industry wasn't sustainable anymore. Declining revenue, declining attendance, declining public interest, declining horse inventory. Even with government investment, millions, for years, the projections showed the industry sinking. So, from the government standpoint, they felt like they were essentially pouring money into a leaking ship.
That's the hard part, because we can't pretend the signs weren't there. Anyone watching Hastings over the last 5 years saw the trend line bending the wrong direction. The 2025 meet, ending with those 3 cards averaging 5.3 runners per race, that's catastrophic in racing terms. The first of those cards had 6 races and only 24 total starters. That's the kind of participation level where bettors check out, horsemen leave, and the whole cycle spins downward.
Exactly. And horse population issues are lethal for racetracks. Fewer horses mean smaller fields. Smaller fields mean bad betting opportunities. Bad betting means lost revenue. Lost revenue means horsemen take their stock elsewhere. And Hastings, by location, is isolated. It's not sitting next to a giant California or Kentucky horse population. It doesn't have a prairies pipeline. It doesn't have the American Midwest shipping in. So once the numbers started shrinking, it became really hard to reverse the tide.
But at the same time, this is Hastings. This is a track with lineage, with history. Exhibition Park was its original name, and it sat right there on the Pacific National Exhibition property like a time capsule. It survived world wars, economic depressions, and countless industry shifts. For it to close, something seismic had to happen, and that seismic force was the government saying, we're done funding this.
Which is interesting when you zoom out, because the casino model, where slot revenue supplements purses, has kept tracks alive all over North America. Look at New York. Aqueduct relies heavily on VLT revenue, and we just saw this weekend a Justify Gelding, Life and Times, crush an allowance race there under Jose Lizcano for Todd Pletcher. That whole racing ecosystem thrives largely because the purse structure is beefed up by casino revenue.
Same with Kentucky, same with Ohio, same with West Virginia. A couple of decades ago, this model pumped life into dying circuits, but British Columbia decided it didn't want to play that game anymore. And what they're saying essentially is that even with casino money boosting purses, the interest, public, economic, cultural, just wasn't there.
And unfortunately, once you lose the financial reasoning, nostalgia alone can't save a racetrack. That's why Great Canadian said the decision was extremely difficult, but ultimately unavoidable. They're a corporation. They answered to business realities, not sentiment.
Let's talk about the human side, because corporate statements don't capture that. Behind the gates at Hastings, there were grooms, trainers, exercise riders, veterinarians, farriers, jockeys, mutual clerks, security workers, concession staff, hundreds of people depending on that racetrack for their livelihood. And many of them don't have an easy next step.
Not everyone can just pack up and move to Woodbine or south to Emerald Downs. Some have families, some don't have the financial cushion to relocate. And thoroughbred racing isn't like an office job where you can pivot industries overnight. These are specialized skill sets tied to a niche ecosystem. Losing a track is losing a community.
And then there's the emotional toll on the owners and trainers who spent decades investing in Hastings, who bred BC breds thinking they'd debut on that oval, who kept the sport afloat during lean years. Suddenly, all that infrastructure becomes obsolete. You can't just tell a BC breeder, ship to Kentucky. The economics aren't comparable.
Right. And while Great Canadian says they'll provide support through the transition, the reality is that many racing participants are now scrambling to figure out their future. Some might retire early. Some might disperse their stable. Some might uproot their lives entirely.
On the flip side, the physical land itself, the track property, is likely entering a new chapter. There's been ongoing speculation that the Vancouver Whitecaps could build a stadium on that site. MLS wants more modern soccer infrastructure, and Hastings sits on prime city-owned land. So you can almost feel the developers circling.
It wouldn't be the first racetrack to fall to redevelopment. Hollywood Park in California, now SoFi Stadium. Garden State Park, gone. Longacres, it's a Boeing office campus. Bay Meadows, mixed-use development. Once racing loses economic justification, the land value almost always wins.
Still, seeing a 133-year-old racing institution quietly extinguished hits harder than all the redevelopment logic. Because Hastings wasn't just a venue. It was an identity for Vancouver racing.
Let's take a moment to zoom back to the larger racing world, because this closure comes at a time when the sport is in flux globally. We've got major stars and storylines continuing elsewhere. Just this week, the Racing Roundup included big names. Life and Times showing promise for Todd Pletcher at Aqueduct. First Mission taking the Lexington Stakes at Keeneland with Louis Size. And even news like Gary Stevens buying D. Wayne Lucas Arkansas home. The sport is still thriving in pockets. Talent is rising. Sires are evaluated. Great horses are still being bred and raced.
But Hastings' closure reminds us that not all circuits are thriving. Some are aging, some are shrinking, some are bleeding out quietly. And when one of the oldest active racetracks in North America shuts down, it's a wake-up call about the fragility of the sport's infrastructure.
What does this mean for thoroughbred racing in British Columbia going forward? It's bleak, at least in the near term. Without Hastings, there is no mainstream flat racing circuit in the province. There are no alternative tracks waiting in the wings. Rebuilding from scratch would take years. Land acquisition, investment, regulatory approval, purse structure, community support. It's not impossible, but highly improbable.
There will be people, optimists, preservationists, who try to mount a revival. BC loves its traditions, and Hastings was one of the oldest. But any revival effort will face the same economic realities that killed the track: diminishing public interest, limited horse population, and no government willingness to subsidize.
The other lingering question is what becomes of the remaining horses. Some will ship out of province. Some may land in U.S. circuits. A few may transition to different careers. But if there's one thing the racing community does well, it's rally in times of crisis. It wouldn't surprise me to see owners and trainers across North America opening stalls to displaced Hastings horses.
And maybe that's where we end this conversation, not on the closure itself, but on the legacy. For 133 years, Hastings Racecourse gave people memories. Families spent summer afternoons there. Young jockeys started careers there. Trainers made names for themselves. Horses flashed brilliance under those grandstand shadows. That doesn't vanish because a corporation closed a chapter.
Exactly. And racing as a sport is built on memory, on lineage, on the idea that greatness echoes.
So even though the final stretch run has already happened, even though the last gate has closed, the heritage remains. And maybe that's the only comfort racing fans get today.
Well said. And to everyone listening who worked at Hastings, raced there, bet there, or simply loved that little oval by the Pacific, Our hearts are with you. This chapter ends, but your impact never fades.
We'll keep tracking the future of racing in British Columbia, the redevelopment talks, and the movement of horses and horsemen. Stay tuned for more coverage.